Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Curious Mindset powered by 64 Tech. I'm not Bandish. Bandish couldn't be with us today. He's had to go elsewhere, so he sends his apologies. So I'm standing in for him. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to those who are new. If you're new, 64 Tech is a technology company, hardware provider, software, cloud, and services provider, and they know, as technology leaders and providers, that the biggest problem in tech does not come from the technology itself. It comes from the people and the people challenges that we all face. So that's what this community aims to do. That's why we run fortnightly sessions where there is no sales, just an hour for you guys to get the knowledge that you need to lead your teams out there in the field. So today we have a speaker who's come directly from the community from a request. It's come from Kevin himself, because he has all the books and we had nothing else to give him from the book club. So I think Kevin's original request was that how do we get, as tech leaders, to buy in from the board? How do we convince the CFOs to buy into our tech solutions? Could we perhaps run something on storytelling? So I had a look round and I found Harriet. And not only is Harriet a brilliant expert on storytelling, she's also a Lego Serious Play facilitator. So stay tuned for maybe a session on that. So do let me know if you're interested in that. And as with all these sessions, let me know if there's anything we're missing, if there's anything you would like. And with the negotiation element, if storytelling doesn't go far enough with you in negotiating with the board, we've got our next session is former SAS hostage negotiator Floyd Woodrow. So we'll go to that next. But for now, enjoy the next hour. I'm going to hand over to Simon Hartley, who is our resident host and sports psychologist and coach. Over to you, Simon. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was going to introduce this by saying once upon a time, there was a man called Kevin who asked a question in the Slack channel about how we engage our board and get buy-in from our board. But I'm not going to do that because Bryony's already covered that bit. What I will do, though, is welcome Harriet. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Harriet,
thank you for having me.
When people talk about stories and the power of storytelling, sometimes leaders don't grasp why they need to tell stories. Why do leaders particularly need to be great at telling stories?
I think that telling stories is one of the core ways that we as human beings have communicated and have communicated for literally thousands of years. And because of that, it's a really great way of sharing information in a way that becomes naturally viral. And so people are very good at remembering stories. They're very good at repeating stories. There are some slightly disturbing statistics about exactly how much of our daily conversation comes down to gossip and the passing on of stories that we've heard. And so if you can utilize stories as a leader, you have a really strong possibility of kind of instilling the key messages that you want your team to hear in a way that they should, for the most part, be really open to hearing them.
Mm. And when we're talking about stories here, we're not talking about people writing screenplays or novels or whatever. Well, when you see good stories in business settings, particularly, what do they look like and sound like?
Well, a story in a professional context, you're absolutely right. This isn't Lord of the Rings. This isn't Harry Potter. This isn't any sort of larger fictional universe that we're bringing in. A good story in a work context is somewhere between 60 to 90 seconds long and is entirely designed to deliver a message. Now, it could be that you're telling a story because you're meeting somebody for the first time, and maybe you're just talking about where you went on holiday, or maybe you're catching up with someone after you haven't seen them for a while. You're just sharing some of the news about what you've been up to or what they've been up to. And those sort of social stories, they don't necessarily need to have a meaning, because the whole intention of sharing those social stories is to strengthen the relationship. But when you're in a circumstance where you're presenting, especially if you're trying to win people over, you can utilize stories as analogies and extended metaphors that deliver those key messages that you want. And that's when we really want to be looking at that 60 to 90 seconds. I mean, a really good example of this is TED Talks. Think about how many TED Talks that you've ever seen that start with somebody going, Well, when I was 6 years old, I fell out of a tree and broke my leg. And you have to wonder what's happening to all of these TED Talk speakers because it always seems to happen when they're six and it always seems to involve some sort of minor to major injury. But they bring these things in and then they use this to justify how they were fascinated by the x-ray at the hospital and that's why they became a doctor and that's why they've developed this new technique for studying bones or the such. And they almost always use them in a technique called bracketing. So you start your speech by giving a story, kind of introducing your concept, and then you give the chunky, the meaty part of the speech that you want people to remember. And then at the end, you come back to your story again. So you have literally bracketed a story around material, potentially technical material, potentially complicated material that you really want people to listen to. And so, in providing that kind of story sandwich, you've made it more palatable and easier for people to understand. And that's one of the key ways in which a leader can use a bit of storytelling to win people over or to make what they're saying more appealing to, hopefully, an audience that you want to wow.
Mm. And the temptation often is just to sort of transfer the information. We've
Oh,
got some
yeah.
information. We want you to have some information, and it's kind of a pretty dry, emotionless process. But actually, just weaving that into the form of the story gives it another dimension.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was at Accenture for 5 years and had a brilliant time working with Accenture Digital. And in my last couple of years there, Accenture actually had a big movement towards storytelling as a core skill that they wanted everybody to learn. Because, like so many large scale companies who work in digital, who work in technology, they had a lot of very talented, very intelligent, amazingly technical staff who could not be put in front of a client or a customer because they didn't have the language to explain what they did without falling into jargon and a technical delivery. And so one of the big aims that Accenture had, and I actually ended up helping out. That's how I ended up doing this. I fell into it when I was in consultancy and absolutely loved it. Was trying to give people a toolkit, a very logical toolkit around storytelling that they could use to explain things like system architecture, complex pieces of software, research projects, discovery projects, the kind of things that, let's face it, the board, they've heard the words for, but they may not understand the context.
Mhm. Yeah. And I mean, there's a very different way that our brain interacts with a story versus just information. What happens in our brain differently when we're either just presented with information or we get it in the form of a story?
So there've been several studies where they actually look at people listening to the stories and they kind of they scan the brain. Now I have to admit I don't know if this was like a CAP or an MRI machine or what, but they scanned the brain of somebody who was telling a story. And first of all, that brain lights up all over the place. It is a fireworks display in there. Bam, 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 bam. And more parts of the brain light up when you're telling a story than when you're just reciting factual information. So that's a first part. We're using more of our mental capacity.
Mhm.
Now, if the story is being told well enough, then the parts of the brains of the listeners will light up in the exact same manner. It's a phenomenon known as neural coupling, and it's basically the brain patterns of the speaker and the listener align. Now, this is kind of fascinating on a couple of different levels because, brains are weird and neurochemistry is incredibly complex. But what this means is if, let's say, I'm telling you a story about a time I ran a marathon, right? Parts of the brain associated with memory will be lighting up. Parts of the brain associated with physical activity will be lighting up. And for the time while I'm telling this story, my brain, my body will actually start to burn calories that little bit faster because those parts of the brain are lit up associated with physical activity. Now, if I'm telling this story well enough and the audience is engaged enough, parts of your brain associated with physical activity will also light up. So it absolutely is worth it if you feel you've had a bit of a lazy week, choosing a sports
Mhm.
movie for your Friday night takeaway accompaniment because it will burn calories just that little bit more. And it kind of triggers all these different reactions in the brain. Storytelling can trigger dopamine, it can trigger oxytocin, which is the empathy hormone, it can trigger adrenaline, it can trigger cortisol, and it's fascinating all of the different things that storytelling can do.
Mm.
And it's just, it really, you can, I'm sure you've had this experience, Simon. I have this in airports sometimes. Maybe you're sitting in an airport or you're at a train station or something, waiting for a train, and somebody else is there, and you just end up having a little small talk conversation. And suddenly you might end up having a slightly more in-depth, kind of quite detailed and quite deep conversation. And what is happening here? We're sharing stories and we're getting this oxytocin boost, which is the empathy hormone, and we're suddenly feeling very close to this person and we're able to tell them things knowing that we're never going to see them again. And it can literally change our brain chemistry a little bit, which is
Mm.
weird when you think about it. But there's absolutely no reason why we can't use that professionally. Engaging people with stories that appeal to them and stories that they find interesting to listen to, they want to listen to you more. And that can be a really good way of building those meaningful relationships or deepening existing relationships to build more trust, to build more connection. And as we all know, I'm sure it's come up in one of the previous ones because it's a pretty well known fact that teams that feel that they have those stronger emotional connections, they are more productive, they get more done, and they just, I think it's something like 25% more productive.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
really a fascinating thing. So storytelling as a leader can enable those deeper, more meaningful relationships that lead to better team cohesion and productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Kevin's question, actually, he was talking about how you get buy-in, and
Mm,
buy-in is largely an emotional
yes.
phenomena. And I know what whilst it frustrates a lot of very, very logical, analytical people, decision making is emotional as well. The
Yes.
connections that we're talking about, the rapport, the empathy that we need to build with people, the sort of the depth of the relationship, that's all on an emotional level. And ultimately, a lot of decision making is emotional. So if we're too transactional with the information, we miss this really important dimension where this is emotional.
Absolutely. I mean, there have been there have been studies that show that the part of brain which is really deeply associated with emotion, the amygdala, when people
Mm.
have damaged amygdalas, which is one of the emotional centers of the brain, they can't make decisions.
Yeah.
We might like to think that we are rational, logical creatures, but we don't make almost all of our decisions emotionally and then justify them afterwards with a little bit of rationality and logic as we apply it. And just to kind of re-emphasize that, storytelling is somewhere between 13 and 7 times more memorable than facts alone. Like we like to think that we're going to remember the facts and we're going to put it out there, but some there's a small percentage of the population who are numerically aligned, and it's about 4 to 5% of people. And yes, we tend to find more of them within technology, within digital industries than you do in the wider population, because it's where a lot of us kind of gravitate to.
Mm.
But you've still got the other 95% of the population who are not as numeric as you are, who's not as numerate as you are. And they tend to think more in pictures and emotions than numbers and facts. And so when we want to appeal to these wider audiences, it's always worth thinking about the storytelling that we can bring in. Is there a metaphor or an analogy that helps explain something? Is there a bit of an anecdote about how this is going to benefit our customer or our audience or us, and kind of what this actually means? Because
Mm.
I think that we can all get really focused on numbers because numbers feel so important, but most people have a very limited capacity to remember numbers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of studies that show that stories around numbers are not only more memorable than numbers themselves, but if you have a story that illustrates the number itself becomes more memorable. So
Yeah.
there's a partnership of information that we can do here.
Yeah, and I've noticed over the years that one of those elements that often gets forgotten about is the why. We talk a lot about what, but we forget about why. And
Mm,
I know from my own experience that stories are a great way of emphasizing and shining a torch on the why. Shining a light on the why, which I think brings the whole thing to life. It makes any sort of communication more bright and vibrant.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of the book Start With Why by I think it's Simon Sinek. It's a
Mm,
really good book. It's always on my list of books that I recommend to people. And Carmine Gallo's one, The Storyteller's Secret, is basically Start With Why by another name.
right.
Those are both brilliant books.
And so, knowing that stories are really important, how on earth do we start to learn to become better storytellers?
Well, and this is where I'm going to say the immortal line, which at least some people on this call are going to moan a little bit at, which is that human beings are natural storytellers.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that everybody on this call is immediately going to be J.R.R. Tolkien. We might be natural storytellers, but there's also a lot of advantage to being practiced storytellers. You shouldn't just assume that we can just do it. There are some people who are naturally good at this, and frankly, they are mostly deeply annoying because they're naturally good at this and they've never had to work at it. And I'm not actually naturally one of them. When I was in my 20s, I wanted to be a good speaker, so I actually went out of my way to learn and to practice and to take every single opportunity. And somewhere along the line, I figured some of this out, and I love it. But where do we start? We
Mm,
start with our personal stories, the stories which make us us, the stories of our personal experiences, and the the sort of stories that are naturally going to come up at work. Because maybe you join a new project and you're meeting the team for the first time, you're going to end up giving these people a little potted history of your knowledge and experience and why you're here, so that they get a sense of what you're good at and how they can rely on you. Or you go for a job interview, and job interviews are basically all about storytelling. Tell me about a time you overcame a difficult situation. Tell me about a time you balanced the needs of two competing projects. Tell me about a time you managed somebody who was particularly awkward. you know Interviewing for jobs is all about storytelling. And when
yeah.
you're doing that prep the night before, it's okay, what's a difficult situation that I can tell them about? What kind of digging into that kind of way.
Mm,
But there are some tools and techniques, and there are some things that people do which can trip you up around storytelling. And so one of the core exercises that I like to encourage people to do is to think of a story that delivers the message, "You can count on me." Because as I mentioned before, if you're telling a story in a work context, which is not just about, hey, I had a great weekend, how was your weekend,
mhm.
social cohesion and bonding, there really should be the kind of Aesop's fable moral or meaning of the story. There should be a reason why you're telling it.
Yeah.
So a story that delivers the message, "You can count on me." In fact, let me give you a quick one, and maybe we can. I think we were talking about leaning on Steve and seeing if he's got one that he could
Uh,
share as well.
Yeah. The technical term is throwing Steve under the bus, which we
Oh,
shall
yeah.
do in a second. Yeah.
Okay, so in my second or third job in London, I was actually working as a new business assistant in a media agency. And this is a good 20 years ago. We didn't have the technical support, or maybe the company just hadn't invested in the technical infrastructure that was necessary. So we didn't have backup servers. There was no cloud. Everybody here is fully aware of the advances we've made in the past 20 years. There was an awful lot of USB drives that we kept everything on, moving from crappy giant desktop computer to crappy giant desktop computer who went around the office. My boss was about to pitch the next day for a massive account, and she had me build her a 140 slide PowerPoint document.
Wow.
Now, in my current role as a storytelling coach, I should tell you there is never, ever, ever a need for a 140 slide PowerPoint document. It is completely unnecessary, but little like 23-year-old me did not know this and wasn't going to argue with my boss. I had printed it out, I'd given it to her, she had written all over it, and she gave it back to me, and I went to stick the USB in the computer and open it up, and the file was corrupted, and we did not have a backup. What we had was the printout.
Wow.
Yeah, you can imagine the stomach falling. And this was on like 4 p.m. on the Thursday, and they were coming in at 10 a.m. for the pitch the next day. And so I stayed in the office until about 4 a.m. in the morning, sending the obligatory all staff email, I'm working late, does anybody want pizza? So that everyone knows about it. And rebuilt the deck. And actually the deck was better because at that point it was consistent because I was rebuilding it all at once as opposed to just stealing slides from everybody around me. Had the deck done by 4 a.m., backed it up in several different places. I do learn my lessons, and gave it to my boss USB. She pitched with it at 10 a.m. and won the account. And so that's an example of a story of how you can count on me, or my colleagues can count on me to put this together. I wonder, Steve, do you have one like that? What's a good example of a story about how we can count on you?
Yeah, I've got one sort of similar, Harry, in a way that it's kind of an end of day type um, mini nightmare scenario, I suppose. And this is one that I'll call from my past. I had a team. One of the guys in my team was 18-year-old, quite young, keen as mustard. Anyway, he had a task of doing some work in our Exchange server environment, and it went wrong. Towards the end of the day, the whole team had left to go home, and I was just about to kind of leave to go home myself. And this guy Tom said, "Yeah, Tom, Steve, this doesn't work quite right. Some of the accounts have been locked out, but I'll pick that up on Monday morning, you know." And I was like, "Okay, what accounts are
Mm.
these?" It was the chief exec, it was the CFO, it was all of the people that
Oh,
don't want to be locking out with a bit of human error. And I said to him, no, you've got to stay back. We've got to fix this. And I could see his heart was dropping because he had plans that Friday evening, and he didn't really want to be sacrificing his 18-year-old lifestyle, should we say. Um, but anyway, I said to him that we're going to get this done. I'll stay here with you. We'll work on it together. We've got to get this fixed. So we're in it together until we finish. Long story short, we finished at about probably 8:30 p.m., which wasn't as bad as your 4 a.m. But he was able to then get to the pub, so he was happy as well. And so everyone was happy, and that was a story of how, with my team, they can count on me as the leader that isn't just going to leave them in the lurch and go home myself.
brilliant. Right, so now we've got two stories that we've just told. Now, I am sure, and I can see a couple of comments coming up through the chat box, and I think one of them was about this, which is sometimes we're telling a story and maybe we forget a key detail until we're like halfway through and we have to go, oh, by the way, this happened in Greece. Or by the way, this was at a point when I was living on a farm in Devon. And it's like it changes the entire story and it makes you seem unprepared because this is something that should have been mentioned already, right? Or maybe we're telling a story and we get distracted by a particular detail that comes up. So me diving into the little bit about how the infrastructure was terrible and we didn't have cloud computing and all of these things. I didn't need to give you that much detail. I could have done it shorter. And so these are two massive pitfalls that happen to people all the time. The idea of not having all of the detail in the right place or the detail itself becoming distracting. And so one of my solutions for this is to apply a little bit of story structure. Now, I'm just going to share my screen for a second so everybody can see this because it's a really different thing. And Bryony, can you just reactivate my screen sharing? But because we had a little technical issue earlier, but we're all fixed now. The most traditional form of storytelling structure is a 3-act structure, right? And everybody here will have heard of it. Beginning, middle, and end, right? Beginning, middle, and end. Nice and simple. Here's the problem with beginning, middle, and end. Beginning, middle, and end, people focus their attention on beginning. And sometimes we can spend so much time talking about the beginning of a story that the rest is like, and then we fixed it. And that's not actually the setup. So I don't like to use the word beginning because I think it gives you a little bit of a tendency to be a bit David Copperfield and start off with, I was born, or so they tell me. And it's like, you know what? I want to hear about the thing that happened when you were 26, not when you were 2 minutes old. So rather than doing beginning, middle, and end, I like to set the context, right, for a story. Set the context right there at the beginning. Then the thing that follows context is complication. And complication is almost always, for a story we're telling at work, the thing that went wrong. Now, occasionally, it could be the thing that went right. You met your spouse or you had a child and it enabled you to reinvigorate the world, or, but most of the time it's the thing that went wrong. We're telling these stories so people can learn from them. It has to be about a problem we overcame for the most part. So context, where we are at the beginning of the story, complication, the thing that went wrong, and then consequence, how did we fix it? What did we do? How did we overcome the problem of the complication? And it's all underneath that conclusion, right? Now, this looks really linear. It's not. It can actually, and more truthfully, should be a bit more like this. Every story should have these 4 parts: context, complication, consequence, and conclusion. But the order in which you tell them can change, right? To tell an interesting story which is going to get people's attention, you have to start with the most interesting thing. You want to hook the attention of your audience. And that could be something about the context, something about the complication, or something about the consequence. So I could say, I'm going to tell you about the context. Let me tell you a story of when I was a new business assistant in media in London, which is what I did. It's not a hugely interesting beginning, right? I could start with the complication. Let me tell you about the time I lost a 140 slide PowerPoint deck the day before we were pitching. Or I could even start with the consequence. Let me tell you about a time I stayed in the office till 4 a.m. to save a new business pitch. It's probably that one. So if I'm going to start telling it with this setup, I'm going to go with, let me tell you about a time I stayed in the office till 4 a.m. to save a new business pitch. Pause. I was a new media assistant. I was a new business assistant working at a media agency in London. And then I tell the story. I hook with the most interesting part of it, and then I go back to tell. For context, by the way, rather than that kind of ever expanding and potentially absolutely huge beginning, there is 2 bits of information that you need to provide for context. If you're telling a personal story, you need the historical context. When did this happen? And the geographical context. Where did this happen? When and where. And you don't necessarily need any more. So for my story, when, I want to establish it was 20 years ago when we didn't have cloud backups. And where did this happen? In the job with the terrible infrastructure. And then I can get into what the actual problem was. So I don't end up spending a lot of time telling you about the media agency, or that I was in a 5-person team, or that my boss was very inspiring, or that I'd only been in the job for 6 weeks. This is all extra detail. It's extraneous. It distracts. We want to get up to that complication as quick as possible. So my advice for everybody when you're looking at this from an exercise point of view is to take these elements, context, complication, consequence, and reduce your story down to the smallest and tightest version of it you could be. So for me, it would be, I was working as a new media assistant in London in a company, new business assistant in London in a company which had terrible IT infrastructure. Right? This was about 20 years ago. We had no backups. Everything was saved on USB drives. And I go on to the conclusion, the complication. We had a 140 slide PowerPoint deck, which we were pitching the next day. I had a printout, but when I went to check the USB and make the amendments from my boss, the entire file had corrupted and there was no backup. On to the consequence. So I stayed in the office until 4 a.m. I rebuilt the entire deck, and actually, you know what? It looked better because it had all been done consistently. And so I can actually tell that story in something like 15 seconds. But it's less interesting. So now, having reduced it down to its skeleton, I want to expand it back out. I want to talk a little bit about staying late in the office. I want to talk a little bit about that feeling of when I found out the deck had been corrupted and the utter dread of what was going to happen. Because as Simon has already established, storytelling is about emotion, and it's about drama, and it's about tenseness. So we reduce the story to its core components, and then we make a choice about which bits we want to pull back in, which expand it from that 15 to 20-second minimal version out to being about a minute with a bit more narrative, a bit more fun, a bit more drama, a bit more engagement for our audience. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. And as you're saying it, It reminds me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with an executive who was doing exactly what Kevin was asking about, sort of selling an idea into the board.
Mm.
And they walked in there and said, I've had this idea. It's this. I want some funding for it. And the board sort of ummed and ahed about it. And yeah, thanks very much. We've got other stuff, etc., etc. And they left a bit deflated that they hadn't really had the audience that they wanted for this, or the airtime that they thought it deserved. So we sat down, we had a coffee, and I said, come on, tell me about this. And he said, and then started with, well, we encountered this problem. And so because we couldn't get through it, I was thinking about some solutions, and we tried this and we tried that. And then we tried this thing, and it's really, really good. And I think that we could package that and adapt it. And it just needs a little bit of funding to get it off the ground. I said, that's brilliant. Why didn't you just say that in there?
Right.
And all of what you've been talking about, that bit of context and everything else, he started to pull in. Now, maybe not in a structured way. We were just sitting down over coffee, but it was all there. And I said, now I get it. I didn't get it when you explained it in there. Now I get it because you've given us all of these component parts. And that's the bit that I think some people sometimes don't really appreciate, and particularly if they feel under pressure.
Yeah.
They come in and try and give you the most abridged version possible, which misses all the rich stuff.
And that's the thing. We might be talking about something very technical, but you're still a person talking to a person. And so if you use some of these techniques to appeal to people, which is what it often comes in, it can really help. And I should say, because I can see that there's a couple of people saying in the chat that it can be hard to think of a story in the spur of the moment. And so this exercise that we've just done, I would encourage you all to get yourself a brand new notebook, because it's January. It's a time for brand new notebooks, everybody. And think of it as your anecdote library, and think about some of the stories that you tell on a regular basis. So it could be the story of "You Can Count on Me," or it could be the story of the time I dealt with a difficult customer, or it could be the story of, for example, if you're implementing a new piece of software and for your company, but you've done it before, why did you do it before? What problems is it going to solve? The kind of stories that come up. Because if you do this exercise about reducing down to context, complication, consequence under the banner of the conclusion of the message you want them to hear, and you work it out and you just make a couple of notes in the book, our memories don't work like we think they do. So when I'm telling the story of that time I ran a marathon, I'm no longer thinking about the time I ran the marathon. I'm thinking about, my brain is accessing the last time I told the story of the time I ran the marathon. So if you just sit there, like have a cup of tea, get a glass of wine, get your notebook, and make some notes about the different stories you can tell, these stories will be accessible to you in your brain to pull back out in the future. Because you won't be thinking of the time that it happened. You'll be thinking of the most recent time you thought of it, which is when you were just thinking about a bit of storytelling structure. What's my dramatic moment? Are there any emotional stakes? How can I tell this in a way which is accessible to me? And this is one of the ways of doing that, is you then build yourself effectively a little personal library of stories that you can draw upon.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's a really good way of using this for your own context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right, just taking a bit of time out before we do that kind of pitch, whatever it is, and think about how people are going to receive it, as well as how we transmit it, and how just by playing around with the way we transmit it, they're going to receive it really, really differently. And for anybody who came to our live session that we did, it's probably about maybe a year, 18 months ago, Dominic Colenso was talking about how does it make people think and feel, what they've got to know something, do something, think and feel something. And sometimes it's that feel bit that we miss because we're too fixated with the know, or maybe the do. But like we said, decision making is emotional.
Yeah.
Brilliant. We're going to open up for questioning. If you guys want to hit the gallery view in the top right hand corner, that should open up your screen. Steve, as well as now the wheels of the bus have gone over you and you've sort of brushed off the tire marks. Have you got any thoughts, reflections?
honestly, there's several really big kind of wow moments for me. That last one was also really powerful for me, Harriet. The idea that when you replay a story, you remember the last time you told it, which as soon as you said that, I was like, that's exactly what I do, and I never noticed. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. Um, I've got a bit of a question actually around some of my experiences
Hmm.
where storytelling probably comes to it into its own, but I'm not too sure. And it's when I'm giving kind of bad messages, like potentially upwards. Um, so in my career, I've often been like the IT incident manager. Several people in the audience will probably relate to this, where some outage occurs and somebody has to be the forefront of the face of the IT team, basically sort of telling what we're doing to
Mm.
fix it, what the issues are, blah blah blah. And then thinking about what Simon said about when we're under pressure, oftentimes some of this training would come into its own. I've sometimes struggled to give the bad news upwards because I know that the minute I start saying what the detail is, they're going to say, "Whoa, how did that happen?" And can storytelling help in this sort of way to help give us more time to tell the full story?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously it depends on the context, and when you are there, if you're going to say there's been a massive data breach, you're going to want to lead with there's been a massive data breach and then keep the storytelling for the, well, how did this happen? And so you have the story of, well, this happened because we had this and we didn't have this and we needed this person and we didn't have, and so you can provide a little coherent narrative. I think especially when you're giving bad news, giving people information so they feel like they're they have the context, they know the wider detail, that they're being informed is really important, because people react badly when they feel uninformed or they feel that something is being hidden from them. So this is one of the circumstances where using a bit of storytelling, okay, we were in this circumstance and this happened and this happened, and you know what? That shouldn't have happened, and we're investigating as to why it did. But it's important that you understand that these things happened in this order, which has led us to this place. And
Mm.
I think giving people that extra piece of information, giving people the insight, because I think especially when we're delivering bad news, there's a tendency to not want to put too much detail in because you think that, that's going to be badly received. And then people feel like you're glossing over it. They're not getting the big picture. Why are you not telling me? Kicks off a lot more suspicion than actually having that terrifying moment of honesty of, okay, this is what's happened. And yes, this is very bad. And yes, maybe it could have been prevented, but now we know how to prevent it for the future.
Mm.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah, you're
uh,
making me wonder. Sorry, Simon. You're making me wonder about like in that first moment when you tell the facts, if you almost disclose everything as much as you possibly can, it's only going to get better from there emotionally, right?
Yeah,
Rather than it being extended over a period of time.
exactly. Naturally, we have a reluctance to demonstrate our flaws or our failures, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that if you can be honest and open about this has happened, and yes, it's very bad, but here's what we're going to do about it, that actually gathers a much better emotional reaction from people. Because if you just say this has happened and they go, well, that's bad. Yeah, okay, this has happened, and I'm acknowledging that it's bad, and we know what the circumstance is, and this is what we're going to do next. Because you want to take them from the this has happened into the what we're going to do next, because it makes them feel that, okay, this has happened, but we're in control. This is not as bad as it could be. We're not just sitting here with things on fire. We've already called the fire brigade. We've already got the buckets of water. We are moving ourselves forward.
mm. There've been quite a few conversations that I've had with Caroline, my wife, where one of us is already quite a long way down the thought process, and we come in to
At
the
different
conversation a long
stages.
way down the line.
Yeah,
And the other one goes, whoa, whoa, hang on a minute. Catch me back up again. Where did you start with this? Walk me through it. And that's when you get to the point with them. And then it just makes sense. But if you're coming too far down the line, when you've already done all the thinking and this is really fresh to another person, they don't really know how you got there or what the landscape looked like or anything like that.
yeah.
It's almost like kind of walking them through the thought process.
It's a conversational journey, right?
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
moving from here to there to there to there. If we just jump to here, you haven't got the information. We need to go, okay, this, then this, and now we're going to do this next. Which is
Yeah.
not to say get yourself bogged down in the early detail, but be prepared to take people through a logical regression of this happened, therefore this happened, and here's where we are, and this is what we're going to do next to resolve it.
Because actually, part of the issue is, or part of the sort of wider phenomena around storytelling is we share a mental space together,
Mm,
and you know, through this process, we're actually sharing that little mental journey rather than us being a long way down the line and then being back on the start line, or expecting them to hop in where we are, which
absolutely.
often doesn't
Absolutely.
happen.
But remember, this is also the context of tell it quickly, which is not to say speed up and go, oh, like, oh, just get to the point. Because if somebody is in a critical situation and something has gone badly wrong, they want the high level points along the route. They don't want a 5-minute diversion into this is why you should have given me more L&D money for the team last year when I asked you to. You know, they want, it's all about getting to that point and moving forward.
Yeah, and going to your example about something kind of big disaster stuff has happened. Um, if you look into any big critical incident, it was never one thing.
Yeah.
Always an accumulation of things that led up to it. You know, because we didn't spot this, we didn't do that, and because we didn't do that, this didn't happen, and da da da. And that's always how critical incidents unpack. And so, actually, to paint the territory properly and to understand it properly, you probably have to go through that process in order to say, and that's why this happened.
For the want of a nail. All the way through that kind of traditional for the want of the nail, the shoe was lost, for the want of the shoe, the horse was lost. Absolutely.
Mm.
And most people, well, actually that might be people of a certain age, isn't it? For the want of a nail. I'm not sure they're teaching it in schools anymore. I don't think my 6-year-old knows for the want of a nail, but it's certainly something my grandparents brought up a lot.
We need to put that back into the curriculum.
Yeah, who doesn't know for the want of a nail? Anybody not know for the want of a nail?
This is your age test now. This is where you find out.
Okay, so it goes like this. It's a poem. For the want of the nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of the shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of the horse, the charge was lost. For the want of the charge, the battle was lost. For the want of the battle, the war was lost. For the want of the war, the kingdom was lost.
Hmm.
All for the loss of a single nail. And so it's just all about context, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
I
brilliant.
may have paraphrased that slightly, but yes.
But well, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That was more than I ever expected. So that was fantastic. I was going to say, well, how do we do this story? But you've already answered all that. So thank you really for that. And I think everybody else has enjoyed it as well. I've seen a lot of comments, and one of them is about how PowerPoint can often get in the way of a good story.
Yes.
Now, quite often when we are invited to pitch, we are sort of told to bring slides, or, you know, we feel naked without them. Personally, I think a great story, if you look at stand-up comedians, you know, they don't have PowerPoints. Ted do a few. What's your advice on this? You know, how do we back up or story, or where and how do we use PowerPoint if we do? Please.
Okay, so PowerPoint is an amazing tool, but people become overly reliant on it. And especially when people are feeling the pressure, they tend to use PowerPoint to document and display the things they actually want to say, which then leads to that most boring of all PowerPoint presentations, when you stand up in front of somebody with a PowerPoint presentation and read your slides to them. And everybody in the audience wants to just go to sleep, because it is the definition of this meeting could have been an email. So there are 3 real reasons to use PowerPoint. There is PowerPoint, which is being used as a document. Now, a PowerPoint document, the intention is to be read. And so you want to have information on the slides where the PowerPoint document is to be read. I am sure that we have all been in circumstances where we've seen those delivery status reports, and they're all in PowerPoint, and there's the red, amber, green, and it's in like font size 8 or something, because they've squeezed so much information onto a single slide, it's actually traumatic and impossible for your eyes to read it. That is a PowerPoint slide that should never be on an overhead projector. That is a PowerPoint slide for somebody to read on their laptop screen. And just way too much information. Then at the other end, we have PowerPoint slides which are there as supporting information behind you. And those should be very visual. They should be charts, they should be pictures, they should be maximum of 15 to 20 words per slide and no more. In fact, I would even say less than 10 if you can get away with it. And so those slides are there because human beings cannot read and listen at the same time. But there's an expectation that you're going to turn up with a PowerPoint slide. So I want to have something behind me while I'm speaking and while I'm teaching, but I want it to be in support of what I'm saying and not a distraction from what I'm saying. So, I mean, Kevin, if you've seen me speak at a conference, you may recall that my PowerPoint decks are pretty much always title, image, not much else. You've probably just seen two of the wordiest slides I have in terms of how these things set up. The problem is that people try and do both of these things. They have this context where they're like, oh, well, I have to include all of the information on the slides because not everybody is going to be there when I'm giving the presentation. Some people are going to read it later. And so you've spent all this time putting this slide deck together and you've written it out so that everybody who's reading it later can get it. And naturally, you're going to end up reading some of those slides because that's the way that you want to deliver that information. And it's the worst of both possible scenarios. So here's what I like to do. I am a big fan of slide notes, right? Now, I don't know why, but there's like a phenomenal amount of people who don't seem to realize that slide notes exist. But they're right there at the bottom of PowerPoint, and you can have as much information as you want in your slide notes. You can literally have a fully written out prose speech that you can put in there, or you can have links, or you can have bullet points. You can do whatever you want in the slide notes. And so if somebody says to me, I want you to produce a deck which has to be both read and presented, I try and do my slides as the information, the kind of executive summary, top level needs to be there for presenting. And so if I've got 3 points, I will have 3 little bullets and I will have them as sparse as possible. So I'm just trying to think of a context right now. If we were giving an annual report, say, and we're talking about this, and you might be doing the introduction about, well, this is how we did in this section, in this division of the company, and here's what our budget was, and what our recruitment was, and what our retention was. I would literally have a slide which is section name, budget, recruitment, retention, and not any more information. But then all of the information that I'm going to say goes into the slide notes. And then what you can do is you can save the whole thing as a PDF, and you basically write to somebody saying, check the slide notes for more information, and they can access it and they can read it on screen in a way which is useful to you without diminishing your slide deck. The other way of doing it is to use hide slide. And so you basically build 2 slides for every topic. You build the slide to present, which is sparse and high level, and then you build the slide to read, which gets into more detail, but you use hide slide. So when somebody is scrolling through it in a slideshow presentation, all of those really wordy slides are hidden, but they're there for somebody reading it on their computer. Mm-hmm. Either one of these options works well. The dangerous one is when you have 1 slide deck for presenting and 1 slide deck for reading. And the second that you've saved types 2 slide decks is the second that they get out of sync with one another. And, you know, well, hold up, you had a slide about this when you presented, but there's nothing in the reading deck. And no, try and keep it in a single deck by either using hide slide or slide notes. But as little information on the PowerPoint deck as possible. There is a really, there's a really good book called Slideology by Nancy Duarte, who is a storytelling coach out of California who works a lot with Apple. And she is a big advocate of what you should and shouldn't put on your slide deck. So that's maybe another one for the book club there. Slideology by Nancy Duarte. Really good.
Yeah. I mean, I use PowerPoint a lot. And partly because I'm a bit of a tech Luddite and it's easy, it's simple, even I can operate it. But going back to what Harriet was saying earlier, the slide for me, it's just a way of illustrating the story. So if I look at the narrative that runs throughout it, the narrative's sort of set, and the slides are just a way of illustrating it. And I'm always a believer that the slide has to add something extra. So often I'll share a picture of the person that I'm talking about. Quite a few of you guys will have met Anne Daniels, and on a couple of occasions I share one of Anne's stories, and I'll put the picture of Anne up there in the Arctic, you know, pulling a sled, because actually it kind of gives you an idea as to what the terrain really looks like. When we say it's you know, there's bits of ice and they're jagged and they stick up like this and it's terrible to navigate over, you can see it because she's smaller than the jagged bit of ice that she's trying to clamber over. So that kind of gives people a bit more. I remember actually watching, God, this is going to test see how many people nod to this one, watching Jack and Ori when I was a kid.
Yeah.
We can see how old you are. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. The little smile gives it away, I'm afraid. So watching Jack and Ori, and they would have, on screen the person with the book reading the story, and then occasionally they'd put a little sort of illustration from the story from Winnie the Pooh or whatever book that they were reading, and that's the way I've kind of seen the use of slides. The other thing I tend to do, if there's a really important question to answer, I'll probably put that on a slide so that the question is there, big and bold in front of your eyes. Because I do know that, especially when I'm doing workshops, there's a good chance that the conversation meanders away from the question. And if it's right there in front of us in black and white, blue and white, whatever, then we're less likely to meander off. And I can always point at the slide and say, but this is the question we're trying to answer. What about the answer to that question? Rather than, sort of getting distracted by question 49 along the thought process. So I use slides for that reason, but very little else. And as Harriet said, I'm definitely not a fan of people reading the bullet point that they've just pulled up on the screen.
Oh, I find that so miserable and boring. I can read faster than you can speak, you put the slide up, I've already read it, and now you're going to very slowly go through point by point and explain it to me. I am wishing for the meeting to be over already, and I'm not engaging with somebody at that point. I'm not.
Does that make sense, Kevin? Was that helpful, useful?
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you. Fantastic. Great idea with the hide slide and the slide notes. And I did think initially when you said it about, or have two decks, but yes, don't have two decks. Understood.
It immediately goes wrong. It immediately goes wrong. Trust me. Two decks never works well.
Brilliant. We've probably got time for one, maybe two more questions. Anybody else got a question they want to throw into the mix, or is there anything in? Oh, yeah, Lawrence.
So a lot of this is we've been talking about stories of stuff that's happened, not stuff that we want to happen. So if I'm pushing a story at my board where I'm presenting and proposing an idea, then I can use anecdotes to say why it might be a good idea, but I really need a news story.
Okay, so I was actually literally just working with somebody the other day on something exactly like this as one of my coaching clients. And he is proposing the creation of a center of excellence within a particular division of his firm. We were talking about a couple of different ways that you can do this. Now, really, there's about three. Okay, so there is the vision, which I know sounds ridiculous to do it twice, but it is basically saying something like, imagine it's the 1st of March 2027, and you're walking into our new office, which has just opened, our state-of-the-art tech office, and you're walking through the front door for the first time, and you can see that this is a smart office. You've swiped your key card to get in the building, and the smart coffee machine over there has immediately started making your preferred morning beverage. So by the time you get to the coffee machine, you can pick it up and go straight to your desk. And so you spin a word picture of the possibility of what it could be in the future. That's the vision. And depending on what you're selling, that can work really nicely because you're talking about possibility and opportunity and like this amazing futuristic. And you can literally use words like imagine if or picture that this is happening. And first of all, using those call out words of imagine and picture, most of us are still quite trained from childhood that if someone says to us, imagine this, we do just immediately, right? So you're tapping into the primary school teacher instinct that is within all of us to do. So you can tell them a word picture of the future vision of how good it is, right? Alternatively, you can use the facts of where you are now. So for my client, he's got this center of excellence that he wants to set up. We talked about this a couple of different ways. The audience that he's going to be presenting to are very conservative, right? They're not about visions and shiny technology. They are about safety and security and reliability. So rather than doing the vision statement, the vision word picture, he is taking an example of how this exact thing has worked for another division and directly led to an increase in profits of X%, and basically saying, and we can take that, bring it across and do it for ourselves and have exactly the same benefits. So you can use storytelling to demonstrate then how something is already working in a very similar context and bringing it into yours, or you can use storytelling to define a vision of the future. This also comes down to a book called Words to Change Minds by Shel Rose Charvet, which is a little bit about neurolinguistic programming. I suspect Simon might already have come across it. But at one point, they talk about towards language and away from language. And towards language is about that optimistic, that possibility, those visions. So it ties in really nicely if you've got an audience who are open to vision. If you have an audience that's that more conservative audience and they want protection and safety and security, we want to use away language. We want to use words like reliable. We want to use words like proven. We want to kind of tie in our approach that appeals in the way that the people who we want to speak to think. So towards possibility, opportunity, amazing visions of the future. Away, this is a reliable, demonstrated, proven approach that we can take and implement without, it's not unknown territory. We already know how this works. And so you've got those two different ways that you can bring it in.
Yeah. And actually, to introduce ideas, some of the what if we could ... So we've got this issue at the moment. It's causing us loads and loads of pain. What if we could find a way to ... Well, as it happens, we've done some thinking on this and we've got some options, or we've got a couple of opportunities in front of us. And so, yeah, you can sort of tie present to future as well, or past to future, to give somebody a bit of it's using a current frame of reference that you can build out from. And again, if you go back to the principle that this is about sharing some mental territory, then if you've got a picture in your head, and we can help somebody else create not the same picture in their head, but a version of that picture in their head, then we're going to share some mental territory, and then we can start having a really good discussion about it. Yeah, brilliant question. Brilliant question. Super. We've got about 3 and a bit minutes left. So at the risk of running over, Steve, I'm going to hand back to you now. And you've got loads of time, 3.5 minutes or 3 and a bit minutes to wrap us up.
I don't know, the session just keeps on giving. It's amazing. Thank you, Simon, for handing over. And thank you, Harriet, for your time. Honestly, it's been jam-packed of insights. I've been frantically making notes because I just don't want to forget anything. So it's been brilliant. I think I'm going to get an anecdote library and I'm going to put this as the first entry into it. And let me tell you about the time when I had a session on storytelling.
When I got thrown under the bus by Simon.
Yeah, that could be another context, couldn't it? No, but brilliant. So, yeah, thank you, Simon, as well for hosting so masterfully as you always. Also, I wanted to do a call out to Brian and Rachel, who work tirelessly behind the scenes every session and don't always get the credit for what they do. Thanks again to Harriet for the session. So much actionable insight. So it's been brilliant. And of course, thanks to the community. All you guys have joined us today. I hope you've enjoyed the session today. If you have, please do leave us a Google review. And also, if you haven't already, join the Slack channel for having conversations in between sessions. There's often some interesting kind of follow-on thoughts after a session that we ask and discuss as a community. Brian, you did share it in the chat earlier, the link for the Slack channel. So go and find that before the session ends. And then a final thank you is to 64 Tech for providing the space here today for us to grow as leaders. I personally really value the community and being involved with you guys. The questions you ask are great, and they always build even more learnings into the session. So that's great. And I can't wait for the next session, which is a nice segue onto the last point. Next, in 2 weeks' time, on Friday, the 2nd of February, that's the date for your diaries. Brian mentioned earlier, we've got Floyd Woodrow former SAS, now leadership expert, and his topic is one of my favorites, negotiation. So bookmark that date. I look forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, have a great weekend.